Welcome to the Compact Murders podcast from compacthistories.com, where we take a look at real murder cases, assassinations and serial killers in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 64, The Assassination of Empress Elisabeth of Austria. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known across Europe as Sisi, was never comfortable with the role history assigned her. Born Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie of Bavaria on the 24th of December 1837 in Munich, she entered the Habsburg world almost by accident. In 1854, at the age of 16, she married Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, a match arranged with her elder sister in mind, but redirected by the emperor's sudden infatuation. From the outset, Elizabeth found herself trapped in a rigid imperial system she neither understood nor accepted. The Viennese court was governed by protocol, hierarchy, and constant scrutiny, all of which clashed with Elizabeth's temperament. She valued physical freedom, privacy, and emotional independence, qualities that were difficult to sustain within the Hofburg Palace. Court life placed her under the authority of her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who controlled access to Elizabeth's children and dictated her public duties. The result was a growing sense of isolation that never truly lifted. Elizabeth responded by withdrawing. She developed an intense focus on her appearance, strict physical routines, and an almost obsessive concern with maintaining her youth. She also travelled constantly. From the 1860s onward, she spent long periods away from Vienna, moving between Hungary, Italy, Switzerland, England, and Greece. Travel was not leisure for her. It was escape. She preferred hotels to palaces, anonymity to ceremony, and often travelled under assumed names to avoid attention. Tragedy deepened her detachment. The execution of her brother-in-law, Maximilian I of Mexico, in 1867 shook her profoundly. Far worse was the death of her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, found dead at Meierling in January 1889 in what was officially ruled a murder-suicide. After Rudolf's death, Elizabeth wore black almost exclusively and withdrew further from public life. Her appearances became rarer, her movements more erratic. By the late 1890s, Elizabeth was an empress in name but a wanderer in practice. She travelled with minimal security, resisted protection, and avoided official entourages. This insistence on personal freedom, admirable in spirit, carried risk in a Europe increasingly marked by political violence. Elizabeth did not see herself as a political figure or a target. She believed anonymity offered safety. That belief would prove fatally misplaced. By the late 19th century, Europe was living through an era of political anxiety that made violence feel disturbingly close to the surface. Industrialization had transformed cities, widened social inequality, and weakened traditional structures of authority. In this environment, anarchism emerged not as a single organized movement, but as a loose constellation of beliefs united by hostility toward monarchy, capitalism, and the state itself. For some adherents, symbolic violence became a means of expression. From the 1880s onward, anarchist attacks shook Europe and beyond. Kings, presidents, prime ministers, and senior officials were targeted not for personal grievance, but for what they represented. In 1894, French President Marie-Françoise Sadi Carnot was stabbed to death in Lyon. In 1897, Spanish Prime Minister Antonio Cánovas del Castillo was shot dead at a spa in Santa Águeda. Only weeks after Empress Elizabeth's death, another anarchist would assassinate King Umberto I in Monza. These attacks were widely reported and deeply unsettling. What made this wave of violence particularly alarming was its unpredictability. Assassins often acted alone, used improvised weapons, and selected targets opportunistically rather than through complex planning. The aim was not escape or survival, but notoriety and symbolic impact. Royalty and heads of state were seen as embodiments of inequality, making them ideal targets regardless of their personal politics or behaviour. Security arrangements struggled to keep pace. Many European royals still moved with minimal protection, relying on tradition, etiquette, and the assumption of public respect. Some, like Empress Elisabeth of Austria, actively resisted guards and official escorts. To her, protection felt like surveillance, a reminder of the very confinement she spent her life avoiding. Switzerland, where Elizabeth would later meet her death, was considered particularly safe. Its neutrality, liberal asylum laws, and reputation for order made it a refuge for political exiles, including anarchists. Ironically, the same openness that gave Switzerland its sense of security also made it a convenient hunting ground for those seeking high-profile targets. By 1898, the danger was widely understood, at least in theory. Newspapers regularly warned of anarchist threats, and governments exchanged intelligence about known agitators. Yet the belief persisted that violence was aimed at institutions rather than individuals travelling privately. That assumption would be shattered in Geneva, when a restless political climate collided with an empress who believed she could walk unnoticed through a dangerous age. On the morning of the 10th of September 1898, Empress Elisabeth was staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage, overlooking Lake Geneva. She had arrived in the city under the assumed name Countess of Hohenholmes, continuing her long-standing habit of travelling discreetly with only minimal staff. Her plans for the day were modest. She intended to take a short walk along the lakeside before boarding the paddle steamer SS Genève, which would carry her to Montreux. Security was virtually non-existent. Elizabeth was accompanied only by her lady-in-waiting, Irma Stare. No police escort had been requested, and none was offered. Geneva, like much of Switzerland, was considered safe, and Elizabeth herself disliked protection. She had spent years slipping through Europe unnoticed, convinced that anonymity shielded her better than guards ever could. At the same time, an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucheni was in Geneva. Lucheni had arrived days earlier, intent on assassinating a royal figure to make a political statement. He had no specific target in mind. When he learned from a newspaper that the Empress of Austria was in the city, he decided she would serve his purpose. Shortly before 1:30 p.m., Elizabeth and Irma Stare left the hotel and walked along the Quai du Mont Blanc, heading toward the steamer pier. They moved at an unhurried pace. Passers-by paid them little attention. To most, they were simply two well-dressed women enjoying the lakeside. As Elizabeth approached the gangplank of the SS Genève, Lucheni stepped forward. He struck her once in the chest with a sharpened metal file he had concealed in his hand. The attack took only seconds. There was no struggle, no cry for help, and no immediate recognition that a fatal wound had been inflicted. Elizabeth staggered but did not collapse. Believing she had been pushed, she continued onto the steamer. Only moments later would the true nature of the encounter begin to reveal itself, turning an unremarkable walk into one of Europe's most shocking assassinations. The man who struck Empress Elisabeth of Austria was Luigi Lucheni, a 25-year-old Italian labourer whose life had been shaped by poverty, instability, and resentment toward authority. Born in Paris on the 22nd of April 1873 to an unmarried mother, Lucheni spent much of his childhood in orphanages and foster homes before drifting across Europe in search of work. He had no fixed residence, no formal education, and no allegiance to any organised anarchist group. Lucheni's radicalisation was unsophisticated but intense. He embraced anarchism less as a coherent political philosophy than as an outlet for anger and frustration. His goal was notoriety rather than strategic change. He wanted to kill someone important, preferably a royal figure, and he was indifferent as to who that might be. Initially, he had hoped to assassinate Prince Philippe of Orléans, but when that plan failed, he turned his attention elsewhere. Crucially, Lucheni did not arrive in Geneva with a weapon. Lacking money, he improvised. He took a metal file, sharpened it to a needle-like point, and mounted it in a small wooden handle. The result was a crude but effective stabbing weapon easily concealed in his hand and capable of penetrating clothing and flesh, without drawing immediate attention. Unlike a firearm, it was silent and visually unremarkable. This choice of weapon played a critical role in the attack's initial confusion. When Lucheni struck Elisabeth in the chest, the wound was small and did not bleed heavily at first. To onlookers, it appeared she had simply been jostled or pushed. Even Elisabeth herself did not realise she had been stabbed. The file slipped between her ribs and pierced her heart, but the tight corset she wore helped limit external bleeding, delaying recognition of the injury's severity. After the attack, Lucheni did not flee far. Passers-by quickly seized him after attempting to walk away from the scene. When confronted, he offered little resistance. He later admitted his actions openly and without remorse, stating that he had acted alone and that his aim was to strike at the monarchy itself. The simplicity of the weapon and the randomness of the target shocked investigators. There was no conspiracy to uncover, no accomplices to arrest. The assassination had been carried out with minimal planning, minimal resources, and devastating effectiveness. In that moment, Europe was forced to confront a disturbing reality. Immense power and prestige offered no protection against an attacker armed with little more than resolve and a sharpened piece of metal. After boarding the SS Genève, Empress Elisabeth of Austria collapsed on deck. At first, her lady-in-waiting, Irma Stare, believed the Empress had fainted, something not unusual given Elizabeth's fragile health and frequent exhaustion. Crew members helped her to a bench and loosened her clothing. Only then did the truth emerge. Blood began to seep through her corset, and a small puncture wound was discovered in her chest. Elisabeth was rushed back to the Hotel Beau Rivage. Doctors were summoned, but there was little they could do. The sharpened file wielded by Luigi Lucheni had pierced her heart. Elisabeth lost consciousness and died shortly afterwards, at approximately 2:10 p.m. on the 10th of September 1898. She was 60 years old. News of the assassination spread rapidly through Geneva and then across Europe. Initial reports were confused. Some newspapers suggested she had died of natural causes. Others spoke of a stabbing or collapse. Once the facts became clear, the shock was profound. Elizabeth had not been a politically active empress, nor a visible symbol of state power in her later years. Her death felt arbitrary, an attack on a woman rather than an institution, and that randomness intensified public horror. In Vienna, the impact was devastating. Franz Joseph I, who had endured decades of political strain and personal tragedy, was informed by telegram. Elizabeth's assassination added to a grim catalogue of loss that already included the execution of his brother Maximilian and the death of their son, Crown Prince Rudolf. The emperor reportedly responded with stunned resignation rather than visible grief, a reflection of how deeply accustomed he had become to tragedy. Public mourning swept the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Memorial services were held in cities and villages alike. Elizabeth, long distant from the court, was suddenly reclaimed as a national figure, her personal melancholy recast as romantic suffering. In death, she became a symbol of vulnerability rather than privilege. Beyond Austria, the assassination triggered immediate reassessments of royal security. Governments recognised that traditional assumptions about respect, visibility and deterrence no longer held. If an empress could be killed in broad daylight with an improvised weapon, then no crowned head was beyond reach. Elizabeth's death marked more than the loss of a royal figure. It signalled a turning point, a moment when Europe was forced to confront how fragile even its most powerful symbols had become in an increasingly volatile age. The legal aftermath of the assassination was swift and unambiguous. Luigi Lucheni was placed on trial in Geneva later in 1898, and unlike many political assassins before him, he made no attempt to deny his actions. He confessed openly, describing the killing of Empress Elisabeth of Austria as an act against the monarchy itself, rather than a personal attack. His aim, he stated repeatedly, was notoriety, and symbolic impact. Switzerland did not permit the death penalty, a fact that enraged Lucheni. He demanded execution, viewing martyrdom as the proper end for a revolutionary act. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Deprived of the public spectacle he desired, Lucheni spent his remaining years in prison, increasingly unstable and isolated. In 1910, after more than a decade of confinement, he died by suicide in his cell, ending the story of the man who had sought immortality through violence. Elizabeth's assassination had consequences far beyond the courtroom. Across Europe, royal households reassessed their assumptions about safety. Informal travel, minimal protection, and reliance on public deference were rapidly abandoned. Security protocols were tightened, police escorts became routine, and the visibility of monarchs was increasingly managed. The idea that royalty could move freely among the public, once a point of pride, came to be seen as reckless. Elizabeth herself underwent a transformation in memory. During her life, she had often been viewed as distant, unconventional, and politically disengaged. In death, she became a tragic figure. Her restlessness recast as poetic melancholy, her resistance to court life romanticized. Art, literature, and later film would elevate her into a mythic symbol of beauty, sorrow, and lost freedom, often smoothing away the harder realities of her life. Historically, the assassination stands as a marker of transition. It revealed how vulnerable traditional power structures had become in the face of modern political violence. A single individual, armed with a crude weapon and driven by ideology, had pierced the illusion of imperial invulnerability. Elizabeth's death did not change the course of European politics overnight, but it foreshadowed the instability to come. Within 2 decades, the world she inhabited would be swept away by war, revolution, and the collapse of empires. The assassination closed Elizabeth's long flight from court life and confirmed that, by the end of the 19th century, anonymity no longer meant safety, even for an empress. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Murder, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmurder.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/murdercoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.